Now, turning to our next guest in Farmers Weekly, a story from Annette Scott around MPI putting an immediate halt to the live export of cattle. And this is after the tragedy of the sinking of Gulf Livestock One in the typhoon of Masca off the coast of Japan. Joining us now is the chair of the Animal Trade Advisory Council, Jim Edwards. Jim, whereabouts, can we just set the scene a little bit, I suppose, in regards to the live export market in the first part of the year leading into this, and how much it has affected the industry to have been put at a massive halt, and of course respect for those who have lost their lives?
Thank you for inviting me, Sarah. It's certainly been a growing trade, and so far this year, since the beginning of lockdown, in fact, there's been about $100 million worth of income come into the rural communities, and these animals have come from maybe about 2,000 farmers. So there's been a spread of that fresh income coming in, which will then multiply as it's circulated around the economy. But this maritime tragedy has really affected it, and the ministry has put a suspension on the trade.
Ray Smith and, of course, Damien O'Connor has been publicly on the record of wanting to review live animal exports prior to this tragedy. So how did that current review exacerbate into where we are today?
The review into livestock exports was initiated in the middle of last year, and so there were some workshops, and the ministry people have been away looking at that, but unfortunately as yet we have not seen the results of the review, and it's apparent we may not see that until after the election.
Let's talk about, I know I do have to have full respect for the people involved in this particular tragedy. I just do need to talk about the flow-on effect, and I'd like to understand around some of those liabilities for our audience who have been involved in that trade and those who have been caught up along the process, and particularly that quarantine. How is that affecting, and where does that liability lie when a halt is brought in so suddenly like this?
Well, everything is effectively on hold while this trade is suspended. And so currently there's just over 25,000 animals sitting in pre-export isolation. And some of those farmers will have already been paid. Others will be paid later as the letters of credit are activated as the exports do proceed across the border.
Okay, so say, for instance, that money doesn't come through. What sort of legalities are around this for some farmers who are fearful about getting paid when so a review could take a long time? We know how long government can take on most things.
Well, there's two things we need to think about with the review. There's clearly going to be a maritime investigation that is going to take quite some time, and that's really going to be driven from overseas, but New Zealand and Australia are both very interested parties in that. Alongside of that, we've now initiated a working group with MPI. So we've been working and communicating strongly with MPI since this event. And today, actually, we had the first meeting of that working group where we're looking at what are the assurances, the additional assurances that can be provided so that MPI is comfortable to issue the animal welfare export certificates, and hopefully these exports can proceed.
And in your role, Jim, what type of advice can you give when there can be an outside freak situation like it has happened, and we don't know and we will not speculate around what did happen in this particular case? How do you give assurance to ensure that this trade can continue?
We have a long history of exports of cattle from the country, at least 25 years, and they have performed well. And you can actually see the results of the more recent exports on the MPI website where they are now published. So we can give the assurance that this trade does perform strongly, the animal welfare is managed very well, the animals arrive generally in good condition. And so we can also show that the ships that have been involved and the other ships that may still be involved are actually safe ships to be sailing. But clearly, we're working with MPI to help them with the additional assurances that they're looking around the safety of the ships for the animals and, of course, for the people too.
About live animals and the wide
around about 2009, and what it does is bring in a quarterly forum, so 4 times a year we meet and bring in the importers and exporters of animals and embryos and semen, and we also bring in the Ministry for Primary Industry staff that we work with or that these people interface with, and we also have involvement from the laboratories and the other service agencies such as Assure Quality, which are providing a lot of the resources used to make exports happen.
Okay, and lastly, I'm just looking here in Annette Scott's article. The next ship is due, and this was next 10 days. So, of course, that was last week. It's getting closer. A consignment of 14,000 cattle. What happens if this does continue? Do we have the ability to continue to keep these cattle in quarantine, or will they flood the store market, or will they backlog our processes? What's the worst case scenario, Jim, that we're trying to avoid?
The first point is that these animals are being well provided for in the pre-export isolation premises around the country, and so they can be kept there. The food supplies are good, the conditions are good out there, so the animals, in fact, can stay there longer, but it has a significant cost, and that's around about $5 per head per day, which is a lot of money to keep these animals going. Now, it's not necessarily the first time that PEI, as we call it, has been extended. I mean, it depends sometimes on how close the ship is and whether it's a day or so late. So it can be extended. So the important thing is that we then look at, well, the preferred option by far is that these animals are permitted to go for export. So each of the 4 consignments that are sitting there at the moment, really the strong preferences and the best outcome is for those to be exported. Okay, the review will continue on. The suspension otherwise might continue, but the important thing is that's the best option for those animals.
Oh, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Jim Edwards is the chair of the Animal Trade Advisory Group. And Jim, you know, our thoughts are collectively with you and the community around this very tragic time. And sorry to ask such sort of hard-nosed questions when it comes to financials and flow-on effects, because the loss of life is huge and an absolute maritime tragedy. So our thoughts are with all the family around and wider colleagues and industry around that. I do need to make sure I do make that very, very clear.
This is Sarah's Country.